Lepo pozdravljeni vsi na tiskovni konferenci, danes sklicani ob začetku dvodnevnega simpozija o socializaciji bank in vprašanju dolga, ki ga organizirate Inštitut za delovske študije in pa Zveza svobodnih sindikatov Slovenije. Moje ime je Dragan Nikčevič sicer, nadomeščam Roka Kogeja, ki je bil napovedan za vodenje današnje tiskovne konference, ampak ima določene obveznosti, se povečujemo za to. Kar se pa tiče ostalih gostov, je pa kot napovedano, če jih lahko omenimo desno proti levi, je to najprej Filip Herschel, ki je sicer asistent za člana nemškega parlamenta Axela Trosta, ki je tam drugi govornik za finance. Potem je tukaj Nick Brooks, marksistični ekonomist, Michael Roberts, njegov kolega iz Anglije, ki je avtor pamfleta, ki ga je naročila Zveza sindikatov v Veliki Britaniji, ki govori o socializaciji bank. In na koncu je tu še Dimitris Liakos, član ekonomskega komiteja in strokovnjak za finance za grško stranko Syriza. Način, kako bomo začeli tole tiskovno konferenco, je, da bo najprej vsak izmed govorcev nakratko predstavil material, s katerim se bo ukvarjal na današnji konferenci, potem pa bodo na voljo še za vaše vprašanje. In vprašanje lahko seveda izrečete v angleščini ali v slovenščini in jih bomo prevedli. Philip, I suppose we can start with you.
Yeah. Hello, good morning. I'm sorry for not speaking Slovenian in any sense that could give you a hint of what I'm actually talking about, so I'm going to stay with English. I hope that's okay. If not, perhaps we can have some translation there. So, this two-day symposium is about, on the one hand, how to deal with problems in the financial, particularly in the banking sector, whether socialization or issue of public ownership and public control is one way out of this crisis and what would be measures to achieve that. And on the second day we're going to focus on the euro crisis as a crisis of the European Monetary Union, of course also as a crisis that has been transferred to states and their public households. Many countries are struggling with huge public debts by now, and how we're going to deal with that. So a few remarks on banking, first of all. So I consider a financial system as to be like a transport system, for example, as an infrastructure. It is a necessity for economy to work, and similar as like a traffic infrastructure. I think it's an infrastructure that needs to be provided in a safely and accessible manner, and therefore I suggest that it's a public good in the sense that the state has to make sure that this financing system is going to work. Insofar, and we have witnessed that very much in the last year, that financial systems have not been very stable, not been very reliable. I think it's a high time to talk about re-socialization of this financial sector, so to say, to make sure that it's really working as a public infrastructure, that it's reliable. And in this context we are very often talking about systemic importance and the issue of too big to fail. Of course, if you need a financial system and the system as such is in a systemic crisis, there is a need for the state to take care of it, to recapitalize banks, to make sure it's gonna still working for the purpose of the real economy in the society. But as we know, in good times, banks are making good profits and good businesses, and profits from that, if it's a private system, is normally going to the shareholders and to the owners of private banks. But when it comes to a crisis, the state has to show up in some sense as the lender of last credibility and needs to bail all of that out. And so my argument would rather be, if we need a financial system, particularly in a crisis, and that is very costly to maintain it, then why should not the state make also the profits as long as it's not in a deep crisis and doing well? Profit, of course, should not be the major purpose of a financial system, but there is no reason to just privatize benefits and always socialize losses when it comes to an economic crisis in the financial sector. And perhaps the last remark on the euro crisis. From a German point of view, we consider the crisis of the European Monetary Union as really to be a systemic crisis of its construction. So it's not mainly a crisis of state debt of some so-called crisis countries, but the whole system as such was very ill-designed. We have a monetary union with no binding system of coordination. That automatically means states are in competition with each other for market shares. And Germany was insofar very successful in just dumping against its competitors. So we see, very different from the normal public version that you're going to probably read in the major newspapers all across Europe, we are sure that Germany has a major responsibility for that crisis insofar as in the design of the European Monetary Union, it was Germany who was always preventing to arrange some clearer system of coordination of wages, of social welfare, of taxation, etc. across this monetary union. That was in the 1990s. And then when the union started, Germany basically started with a big program of social degradation. Of course, compared to the absolute situation in other countries, German workers were still better off and have higher wages. But when it comes to unit labor costs, Germany was competing down the rest of Europe, running huge surpluses and therefore forcing the rest of Europe into a debtor situation. And combined with the financial turmoil, with real estate bubbles in several countries, that ended up with a lot of countries in the south having to take in over the debts of their private sectors, which were originally formed just by a very wrong designed European monetary system. And therefore we suggest we must not just talk about sorting out public, so-called public household problems in some so-called crisis countries, but we really have to address these fundamental lacks of coordination of policies in the European monetary union. We want to stick to the euro, but with the system now we have, there's hardly any chance to maintain it for a long time, leaving alone the huge social cost that it particularly produces for Southern European countries.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Sedaj prepuščam besedo Zdaj prepuščam besedo Miku Brooksu, marksističnemu ekonomistu.
Good morning. I intend to concentrate on the question of debt. The crisis has left a mountain of debt, household debt, corporate debt, and the debt of whole countries. I think the latter is the most important because the mountain of debt is one of the main levers which is impoverishing all the people of the European Union and having a particularly harsh effect on the people in the periphery. But the burden of debt and the burden of supporting that debt, paying interest on that debt, has become literally insupportable in some countries. If we take the case of Greece, the authorities, the core countries of the European Union, have responded to the crisis by demanding austerity. what they have produced in Greece can accurately be described as barbarism. You have hospitals with no medicines. Their answer to the barbarism that they have produced is further and deeper barbarism. This cannot go on. I believe that to be a simple fact. As Philip correctly said, this is not a crisis of state finance at bottom. This crisis emanated from the private sector. It's a crisis of capitalism. And the question is, what if you can't pay that debt, then what is the alternative? And we will seriously be discussing the question of debt repudiation, that if you can't pay, you won't pay, and that's all there is to it. It is becoming impossible to pay that burden of debt. That is linked with the issue of socialisation of the banking system, because clearly, as soon as a country says, I'm sorry, we can no longer afford this burden of debt, it's actually more important to keep our hospitals running efficiently than it is to pay interest on government debt, then people, rich people are going to try and take their money out of the country. And so if there are, then we will have to impose capital controls. And if we impose capital controls, well, the only way you can effectively do that is by socialising the banking system. So the problems and the solutions are all interconnected.
Okay, thank you, Mick. Zdaj pa puščam besedo Michael Robertsu.
Well, what Philip said was important, I think, when he referred to the situation of the huge amount of bailout that has taken place and the debt that it's left. I was thinking that when the American banking crisis took place and we had the big collapse of the banks, the US Congress met and it decided it was going to, after 2 votes, it rejected it to begin with, it was going to bail out the banks to the tune of $700 billion. This was a program called TAR. It was designed to really buy the assets of the banks that had gone downhill for the original price in order to bolster the banks up. And it made me think, and some people said it at the time, and perhaps it really sums up what has happened in the last 5 years, is that we've had a program by the European leaders, by the United States, by all the governments, a program of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. That actually the banks have been bailed out in the way that people think socialism bails people out, and the poor people, that's the majority, have been asked to pay for it under the process of a capitalist approach to things. So that this is the solution, when in fact that we've been offered. When I think what we're going to discuss over the next day or so is there another way that this could have been dealt with? Do we have to live with the continual scandals that we've seen in the banking system in the last 5 years after this collapse? One after another, of corruption, of money lost, of betting, of huge and grotesque bonuses paid to the heads of banks, and nothing has changed. It's business as usual. There's been no real attempt to alter this. Nobody has been brought even into the criminal courts for the fraud that has been carried out over the last 5 years. Nothing has changed. So as Philip says, banking should be a public good, it should be a public service. I think that's the thing we should be discussing, how we can do that, and how we can also to work out in our minds that we don't have a banking system if it's publicly owned, which I think is something that we have to see as the basis at the start, that it's not going to be bureaucratic and undemocratic as many state-owned banks have been in the period before. That's a task, it seems to me, that we have to look at to see, is there a way in which we can provide a public service for a banking system with a public service, but also it's democratically run, democratically controlled, so that people can participate and be sure that it's being in their interests and not in the interests of a small group in the government or in the bank itself. And that's the process, I think, that the discussion is going to take. And as been said by the other speakers today, and this crisis that we have, not only in Slovenia but elsewhere, of course, has been a crisis of the public sector, a private sector. Now, the public sector is not in crisis before 2007. Most public debt ratios to GDP, if that's how we normally measure it as economists, were relatively low and falling. There was no particular budget deficits of any major size in most of the countries of Europe or elsewhere. The crisis now in the public sector, the huge amount of debt, is the result of the crisis of what happened in the private sector, starting with the banks and then with the collapse of the private sector and the corporate sector generally across the major economies. I was just thinking about the figures provided by the IMF for Slovenia, which at the beginning of the year. In 2007, Slovenia's public debt ratio was about 25% of GDP. Way, way lower than the target set by the Germans and the EU leaders for where you should be, 60% of GDP. Slovenia did not have a public debt problem. Now, by the end of this year, the public debt ratio in Slovenia will be 70% of GDP and rising because the state is taking on more debt to bail out the banks and to try to deal with the slump that the economy is in as a result. I want to steal his thunder, but Greece has a public debt ratio now of 175% of GDP. 175% of GDP. The program of massive austerity in Greece that the IMF and the Troika is imposing hopes to get that ratio down by the end of this decade to about 120% of GDP. So the sheer pressure upon the Greek people will drive the ratio down to twice the official level that it's supposed to be at by the end of the decade. There is no way this debt can be repaid. It will continue, and that is under the best circumstances, that nothing goes wrong in terms of growth, in terms of everybody paying more taxes, in terms of all the austerity measures between 2013 and 2020. That assumes everything is going to be great in Greece for the next 7 years to get it down to a level twice the official limit that they're supposed to have. There is no way that Greece can do this. I estimate that Greece, in order to get its debt ratio back and repay all the loans that it's now been taking on from the Troika, would have to continue with austerity or the levels of sector pensions and other things for the next 50 years. It is inconceivable. We must discuss the question of what alternative there is in that, because this is no project that will help the Greek people or other countries in southern Europe.
Hvala, Michael. In kot zadnji svojo kratko predstavitvijo Dimitris Liakos.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you about your invitation. It's a great honor for me. Everybody's talking about Greece. I'm from Greece. Well, Greece was the first neoliberal experiment in the Eurozone. And because everybody is asking me what happened in Greece. So let's see what exactly the Troika made in Greece the last 4 years. Well, first of all, 34.6% of the population is threatened by poverty and social exclusion. It's the 4th highest percentage in the European Union after Romania, Bulgaria and Latvia. Second, the rate of the working poor is 15%. 3. 6 out of 10 citizens fail to visit their doctor because they can't afford it. 3 million people out of total, or 11 million, have no health insurance. 40% of the population saves on food in order to be able to buy medicine. According to the Workers' Confederation Institute of Labour annual report for last year, at the end of the 2013, the unemployment rate reached the level of 90.61. It's almost 30%. The last data shows 25.5%. Youth unemployment in Greece is almost 60%. The life standard of the citizen has got worse by at least 50% compared to 2008, as a result of the salary pension cuts, austerity measure. But also due to excessive taxation. The taxation in Greece increased almost in direct taxes almost 50%, in the indirect taxes almost 500%. The last 4 years. Domestic demand has fallen 31% since 2009. In the 4 years of implementation, the memorandum has sunk the Greek economy to deep recession. Now we lost 25% of our GDP. It's the second biggest decline ever. The first one was in the Great Depression in the US in the 30s. and is the biggest in the post-war time. And that's about the public debt. As you mentioned before, now we are on the level of 176, and in 2008 was 107. So in 2020, the target is about 120, and yes, it will be high, yes, of course. The public debt in Greece, it's not sustainable, it's a sustainable level, it's not viable. Of course, we're trying to find out alternatives to solve this problem. And also in Greece, there are a lot of myths about what happened in Greece. Everybody is talking about the fiscal situation of the Greece. Yes, I know, it was bad, okay. But we have another problem, but everybody is trying to hide it. We have a banking problem. In 2008, the government decided to give a support package to the banking sector of 28 billion euros. It was 12% of our GDP at this time. Then the Prime Minister, Mr. Kalamalis, said to the journalists that we have good banks, healthy banks, but how can you excuse that at the same time 12% of GDP go to the bank? I don't know. Also, the total package from this until today to the Greek banking sector exceeded the 200 billion euros. 53.5 billion euros in cash and in public debt, and 155 billion euros with guarantees through issuance of bonds. The banks issue bonds, but they have the state guarantee. So we have over 200 billion euros. At the same time, we have a liquidity problem in Greece. Nobody gives loan to private sector. So we try to, there's no way out. How we can handle all this problem. Also in Greece, we have, as I told you before, myths and paradox. For example, through the memorandum, they try to liberalize all the markets. For example, they try to liberalize the milk, bread, etc. In the banking sector, they try to do the opposite. The four biggest banks, they called it systemic bank in Greece, in 2008 controlled the 60% of the total market. Today, they have a market share of 92%. So it's an oligopoly. There's no competition. 12 banks closed or merged with the four systemic banks. 2 state banks. The first one was Agrotiki. Agrotiki was the Agricultural Bank of Greece. They decided to give us a gift to one of the systemic banks. I remember in 2012, because of my job, I was a fund manager for many years. The Bank of Piraeus have an internal research how agricultural bank saved them. And when I read it, I gave it to the members of parliament of Syriza, and it was a big surprise for them, because the Bank of Piraeus admitted that, okay, we find the victim to save ourselves. After 1 year, they decided to merge the Hellenic Post Bank. It was a depository bank, and they gave it also as a gift to another systemic bank. This is what happened in Greece. So, I agree with all of you that the problem is not a state problem in Greece. As a member of Syriza, we're talking about a crisis that's a pan-European problem from 2010. Now I think that we have to fight hard to find a solution for all of Europe. For the debt, for the banking sector, and also for austerity. There's a title that said, austerity kills. I know very well from my time.
Hvala, Dimitris. Vsi štiri bodo zdaj na voljo za vprašanja. Prosim.
Syriza published last year a report that only 1% of this bailout money actually got for saving the Greek people. All other went to save foreign banks. And just yesterday, the German bank, state bank, stated that they have the biggest profits in history. So are we saving in the so-called periphery, Germany, German banks, and of course, how to stop this? For you and maybe no.
Okay, I do not agree that we save especially German banks.
Foreign banks, yeah.
Yes. Okay. We save the banking system in Europe. Of course, German banks and French banks have a major percentage of the our public debt. But I don't agree that okay, we save German or French. We save the banking sector. Mm-hmm. Okay. This is for me. So, not only the French and German banks, they saved also the Greek banks. At the same time, when we have in March of 2012, we have the PSI, was the private sector involvement. They want a haircut, but they trying to find a beautiful name. What PSI? That means PSI. In Greece, people learned about financial terms all this year. The first one was spreads. I remember my father that he's talking about spreads. What spreads?
On button.
Yes. After this, we talk about PSI. Okay, PSI. It's about a haircut. It was a default for this. Okay. The new one is the primary surplus. The primary surplus, primary surplus, primary surplus. Primary surplus now is a national target. Primary surplus, well, we can achieve primary surplus, and we can save ourselves through the primary surplus, but at the same time, the primary surplus goes to a separate account that there is in the Bank of Greece to repay our debt. So we can use this money for growth, to funding the projects. So, so I do not agree with this that we have a difference with the German people or such like things, but we try to find together a solution for the people, not only for Greece, but for Italians, for Slovenians, for everybody, because otherwise I don't know, we have other problems, democracy problems. For example, in Greece, because of the crisis, we have the neo-Nazis variants, and according to the polls, some secret polls, they are above 10%. Above 10%. So we see the same thing in Ukraine the last weeks. Nazis, fascists that came from it. So we have problem with democracy.
One problem I have with democracy in Greece is also that government forbid the protests. Last time Troika came to check the accounts in Athens, we didn't see any protests because they were forbidden. And the Greece is not the only country. We saw just 2 days ago Australia forbid the protests. They adopted a law that protesting is forbidden. So this is something very precedent because we saw the center of the rebellion in Greece, in Spain, also the protests are there criminalized now, yeah?
Yes, well, we have a lot of demonstrations before the elections of 2012. Yes, a lot. And people are struggling to fight to change the policy. But I think that in Greece now we have a strange silence. People are waiting, I think that, my opinion, that they're waiting for the EU elections in a couple of months. They're waiting to express their feelings, they express their differences to this policy through the elections. So now they're waiting. But if you see that we have a lot of demonstrations, very hard demonstrations, strikes, etc. all these years, but now, imagine this, that according to research, the 40% of the Greek people are depressed. So when you have a depressed, you have to give me a hope. You have to give me an alternative. You have to bring back to his face a smile. So they don't want to participate in this demonstration because they feel that they have the power to change the things. So they, in my personal view, they're waiting for the elections.
Okay.
May I also give some remarks
Yeah.
on that?
Sylvia,
Yes.
just a moment.
I agree that basically the whole so-called rescue packages for whatever crisis countries we are talking about is basically to protect the creditors of that country from a haircut. The rationale behind is basically, of course, if it's foreign creditors, they might not be very friendly about this act, but generally even more I would say it's that you hardly ever know where exactly are which amount of what issued public debts. Of course we know that particularly with respect to Greece, German and French banks have by now, or had in the meanwhile, a large share of that. But the French banks, for example, have deposited very much of that by the European Central Bank by now. Then still, I think it's, the fact is, do you want to blame creditors for being creditors? Or do you want to blame politicians to run a system where you fail, at the end of the day, do not know where is actually the impact gonna happen if you try to adjust to a problem? And I would say, of course, if there are huge public debts and we cannot sustain them, and social security and social rights of the citizens should always be prior to the rights of a creditor, but still then it needs to be, you need an account of who is actually going to pay the brunt at the end. And that is at today's financial system basically not possible. You have a vague idea who is going to pay some share of that, but you, for example, now don't know how many for example, Dutch pension schemes of metal workers finally going to lose like 10 or 30% of their pension scheme by writing off 38% of a Greek debt in a particular bond. And in a situation where you don't know that is, I would say, a crime in itself. Public pension schemes deserve security, and so you cannot expose them to financial markets, at least not in the same way as we are running them now. And so I would generally say, of course, we need to talk about the share that the creditors have to pay, but not just for being creditors, but also for being well, compliance, for being themselves guilty of the situation. For example, in Germany, a lot of the military expenses and contracts between Greece and Germany have been based on very disputable business transactions, so to say. So, completely irrelevant whether Greece can pay or not. I would say whenever it comes to corruption in such a deal, where is the point in repaying that debt? And so, of course, we need a public accounting of where are faults on the creditor as well as on the debtor side for really pushing creditors who are recklessly lending to taking responsibility for that. Whether the debtor can pay or not, this should be independent of that. But when at the end the situation is that the state cannot fulfill its fundamental social obligations to its own people, of course it cannot be that creditors be put before the social needs of the people. Creditors have their rights, but they certainly cannot be prior to the right of people who need medicine.
Ok, hvala. Še kako vprašanje?
I would have 3 questions actually. The first one would be, what are your reactions or how you see in comparison the American dealing with the debt and banking crisis, because there have been, even if not yet in place, some legal efforts to address how the crisis took place, and there have also been, I think, billions worth of settlements because of lawsuits that have been filed in America, and it seems that there is a lack of this in Europe. I'm wondering whether you agree that there is a different situation and where you see reasons for this. Then I would be interested, we had stress tests here in Slovenia in autumn, and we were supposed to have them again because of the whole euro stress tests again. And we have just become a little bit more indebted without any conditions attached. And I'm wondering whether you see that as an opportunity, so euro stress tests, to make very concrete steps towards what you're proposing, and what would these concrete steps be, or what conditions should be formulated. And the last question comes just from my ignorance, but in UK there has been a research done about the payday loans that have been increasing, and I'm wondering whether in Greece or in Germany there has been a rise in those as well. Thank you.
Okay, hvala. So, how do we divide this? Michael, perhaps, on the question of... Okay, so Nick Brooks on the first question.
The first question was about the legals.
And the comparison between the US and Europe, ECB and so forth.
Laws.
Yeah, the different financial regulation systems.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the crisis began in the USA. The immediate trigger was the issue of what are called subprime loans. These subprime loans only occurred in a few states of the USA. All the same, they triggered a global crisis. For instance, we had a bank called Northern Rock, which didn't have a single subprime mortgage on its books, as far as I know, but it went bust in August, September 2008. How is that possible? It's possible because all the banks are tied up together. So the problem is not that the banks are too big to fail, the problem is the banks are too interconnected to fail. In effect, the banking system circulates money is the equivalent to the capitalist system's bloodstream. And if you poison one part of it, eventually you poison the entire bloodstream. Now, actually, although there are important differences in the way that the system, they've attempted to intervene in the system in the USA and in the EC in Europe, there are very common features as well. The first one is that one single banker is in prison on either side of the Atlantic, which is a disgrace. You know, that we hear of outright crimes and frauds being committed on a regular basis, and nothing happens. They get away with it, and they just walk away with loads of public money.
Fine.
Yeah. The second thing is that the banking regulation has been utterly ineffective on both sides of the Atlantic as well. In the USA, they are compiling something called the Dodd-Frank laws, and I believe there are thousands of pages of annexes. And these annexes are being written by the finance industry. And if you read, there's a paper by two people called Epstein and Garrick Hackenbach, who did research into monetary economists. Monetary economists go to university in the USA, they get a certain academic gravitas through their PhD, and then their real employer comes along, which is a bank, and they misuse these people's apparent objectivity to pop them into positions in the House of Congress where they can write the regulations for the financial system on behalf of the financial system. And unfortunately, I think the same is true over here as well. You may want to talk about the different behaviours of the central banks, but I think I should leave that to someone else. But the situation over here is also the case, as I think Michael has said in his speech yesterday, that we've got this Basel III, which is going to take forever to come through, and is going to be utterly ineffective in repressing the apparently insatiable greed and stupidity of the heads of the banking system in any case.
Okay, gremo kar naprej na stresne teste. So, stress test.
Stress test. Well, we've had several stress tests across the Atlantic. The US has had one, which I think they've had two. They introduced it on a legislative basis every year. The stress test in the US was a little bit more severe. It suggested that US banks would have to get their finger out and raise enough capital, which we've talked about what do we mean by capital. In other words, raise enough stockholders' investment and cash to a decent sized level to be able to cope with any potential loss on all the assets they hold, and also to look at how much of those assets are risky or not risky, which is the general procedure which is adopted in regulation. And the stress tests in the US the first time round were relatively soft, the second time round were a bit harder, and of course now that the US banks have, as we've just been pointed out, have reconcentrated, as some of the big banks have gone, then now we have less big banks in the US and they have a bigger share of the market, and therefore in some ways they're even bigger too big to fail, but they are safer in the sense that they've got a much higher level of capital ratio to the amount of assets, risky assets they've got. And of course they can now make considerable profits because they have a higher share of the market. A company like JP Morgan bought one of its rivals for $1 thanks to the gift of the government, and subsequently has unfortunately had to pay a bit more than $1 later on because it found out that the bank that it bought had all kinds of dodgy loans that it should never have issued to people for their housing, and now JP Morgan's had to take on the responsibility of paying that some of those back in compensation. So it's ended up paying more, but nevertheless it's made a considerable boost to its profits. Over in Europe, the position of the European banking system was to avoid any stress tests, whatever they could, as long as possible, and governments went along with that for a while, but increasingly the pressure was there as economists and other analysts noticed that there must have been a huge amount of very risky and toxic, poisoned, as Mick calls it, assets in the European banking system that needed to be cleansed. So we've now moved towards having stress tests in various countries. The UK's had one, as you say, Slovenia. Those countries that are in a position where they're supposed to be taking European EU money have had to have stress tests, but now we're going to have a European-wide, we've had one European-wide bank stress test, now we're going to have another one to see whether banks need to be recapitalised in order to meet the European Union's new banking union, which is going to be introduced by the end of this year into next year. And that ECB stress test is underway during this year. And it will probably produce the result which the banks want, which will be that there'll be a number of banks that do need to raise more capital, are underwater and require more money, but the whole system will be given a bill of good health as a whole, apart from one or two banks. And the total amount of money that will have to be raised will be pretty small according to these stress tests, because I don't know what Philip or other on the table think, I don't think the stress tests are designed actually to cleanse the banks and to sort them out. They're designed to tell the public that things are now fine and that we can now proceed to have a banking system as business as usual, and there's nothing more to worry about as the economies recover. They're not really designed to tell us what really went on, how much was lost, how much remains risky, and how much really these banks are still liable to another crisis before we get to Basel III in 2018.
Okay. Philip Herschel, a follow-up on the question of stress test.
Yeah, I agree insofar as stress tests are about rebuilding confidence. And I think the point that we are talking about such a vague thing like confidence makes clear that, I mean, money is about confidence. It's no material good that you can store in the basement and then you show up with some gold and people know, oh, it's still there, and well, that's fine. And this is why I would say the state is ultimately the last instance that can give this credibility by just guaranteeing it, like guaranteeing pension schemes, guaranteeing deposits, insofar the funds talk about this now upcoming ECB stress test is, if all banks were perfect, it's sure at least one or two of them had to fail just to make clear to the public that it's a strict test. The other way around, if all banks are bankrupt, of course we will also have 2 or 3 banks failing the stress test, because we cannot really tell the truth about all that shit to the public, because otherwise there's no credibility. And insofar, the question is, well, we have to look from the other angle. So is at the end of that more credibility in the system than before or not? And I would say, of course, in the short term you can do that, but in a medium perspective we need a system that is far less complex and far easier to be understood, that people really know what's going on, and not just have to believe that somebody knows what's going on. And I mean, of course, ordinary people on the street, they know what their banking account is and so on. We cannot expect them from all of them to know all the details. But coming from a parliamentarian background, I mean, what are our resources to check on what's going on in the German banking sector? We had some parliamentary inquiry commissions, yeah? But even that, I mean, there are thousands of lawyers of the banks on the one side, and we are with like a handful of people who are actually not allowed to talk about anything of that in the public, and thereby not allowing to, you know, get their own consultants and advisors, leaving alone the money to pay for them, to check what's really going on. And insofar, I would say, also from a democratic point of view, the system that we have is by no means controllable. And therefore it's not accountable, and therefore it's not reliable. And actually I think, of course, there are some financial instruments that are quite useful for some particular problem of a transnational corporation when they're dealing with Brunei and whatever other country. But the margin benefits that these complex instruments bring to that particular company and from that company to the public is so small compared to the risk that are attached to these instruments that there's fairly no reason to allow them. And so therefore our fundamental approach in Germany as our parties to turn the whole system of how to say that in English? So, whenever you want to bring a new medicine on the market, you have a very, very strict regulation and checking and balances, and several institutions that check whether there are some downsides to the product before you are allowed to bring them on the market. In the whole financial system, we have exactly the opposite. Everything is legal before somebody shows up and exactly explains why it's not legal. And because it's so complicated, hardly any parliament knows how to measure what should be legal, because they simply don't understand what's going on. So, therefore, in the future, the only way to really reduce this complexity is to start from scratch by saying they should only be instruments and banking business types that we know and that have proven to be not just beneficial for a very single investor with a strange business model, but for a majority of people and businesses, and at the end for the public, as it serves a general purpose. And if we do not retreat from this idea of everything should be allowed as long as it's not specifically prohibited and illegal, I think we have no chance to actually catch up with the fantasy that the banking boys are putting into their new designs of financial instruments every morning. You know, we have like 25 new financial instruments on the market every week. Who's gonna check whether they have some bad implication on third parties when in some particular situation? That could be a lot of stress tests that can be done about it. And perhaps one remark on the US and the EU. I agree. I would say, I mean, we are still within capitalism, but the general approach on banking regulation was stricter in the US than it was in the EU. Of course, it was also heavily watered down in the process in the US. But in Europe, I mean, financial regulation is a European issue. It is basically dealt with on the European level. Of course, you can do some national benchmarks here and there, but it needs to go all through the European institutions. And we all know that there are some countries in the EU that have some very relevant financial sectors. I'm not only talking about UK. Germany is quite guilty for that as well in some respects. And so you have so many lobbies just undermining this whole process that in the end you stand there with really a vague collection of hardly anything. This is not that everything is bad that is designed, it just had to be at least 20 or 100 times stricter to be really effective. But it's so much watered down that I have no trust in that this is gonna prevent us from the next crisis, by no means. And I'm not talking about 60 years to wait for.
Okay, can I just ask for a brief...
Good things to say.
Okay.
Yeah, we would like to hear the most.
Of course.
Because it's the most stressed country.
Well, about the stress test. Well, before a week, we have a stress test result in Greece. Because there are ECB stress test, but also we have our own stress test. It's an agreement between Bank of Greece and BlackRock, and always make stress test. For the first one, in the 2011, we haven't yet the methodology of the stress test. In the parliament, all the parties asked about this, and they gave all the results, not the methodology. So, the last week announced the results and that our banks have additional capital needs of 6.4 billion euros. The last June, they are capitalized 25 billion euros. So I feel that all the Greek society is like a hostage from them. That, okay, we have a stress test in autumn, but we don't know what will happen, etc. Philip said before about credibility, but to bring back credibility. To whom? In my personal view, to capital markets, financial markets only. I remember that in 2010, after the stress test, the same day, the next day, we have a stock rally, especially in the banking sector. I remember, for example, Société Générale, they had their headquarters, I said before, almost, I remember well, 18% higher the next day, because of the stress test. In the Greek banks, the banking sector, as a stock sector, was 20% higher the next day. It's a good profit for one day. If you are a stock investor, you can get a lot of money in just one day. Also, the Hellenic Post Bank, as I told you before, that they merged to a systemic bank. It had the third biggest ratio in whole Europe. After PSI,
One of the safe.
not
It's very
yes.
safe bank.
Yes, the same bank. After the PSI, they decided that we have to close down. The same bank. The third bank in Europe decided to close down. So, I don't know, we were talking about what? For example, were toxic assets. For example, Greek public debt is proven that it's toxic. But if ECB decided that, okay, I will give guarantee to you, that's not toxic. So, we have, first of all, we have to clear up the rules. What is toxic, what is not. What is the guarantee, what is not. But as I told you before, I feel like a hostage situation.
Yeah.
Like a hostage. Because we don't know if our banks need additional capital and the next autumn. Now, 6 billion. Tomorrow, I don't know. So, I don't think that they try to bring credibility to the system. They try to bring credibility on the financial markets. I've been in this job for almost 15 years. I know what's happening every day. When you have breaking news, good breaking news, might go higher in the markets. If we have a negative, okay, we try to communicate, yes, you know, this is not something like this, especially the last 4 years. I remember that last week BIS made a statement to the central bankers, don't talk too much. Don't talk too much. Because we don't know what we have to do in the near future. For example, they have a criticism to Ben Bernanke, that decided to communicate his quantitative easing, and we know that you have to stop it after, so don't talk too much. Don't talk too much.
Okay. There was, lastly, there was the question of the Payday loans explicitly for Germany and Greece. So, brief questions on that.
Does everybody know what payday loans are? Just to clarify, in the UK we have a lot of them and they're advertised on the telly quite regularly. I don't know if it applies in Europe as well, but basically people who run out of money before they get their next salary can go and get a loan from these loan sharks, this is what they are, little banking operations which say, okay, we'll give you an extra 200 euros, tiny amounts, and you'll pay it back on your next payday, or before your next payday. If you don't, and the interest, the annualized interest for that could be 2,000% a year. And obviously you're going to pay it back next week, so you're not going to pay 2,000% on 200, but of course if you keep getting behind, it builds up. Several people get into serious debt through these payday loans. This is an example again of what we were saying before, as Philip was saying, this is allowed to happen, and then afterwards people realise that perhaps it's not such a good idea and need to regulate it. They didn't check it through the medical advisory service beforehand to see if it was a good thing to do. It was just that banks were allowed to make money using these payday loans, and the result is, of course, the huge amounts of interest are paid by very poor people, even if it's only for a short time, to cover these loans in order to get them through the week. And that's a product of the recession, these payday loans coming up. And every day we have a different company in the UK on television advertising. You're lying, unemployed, on the sofa, watching the television in the afternoon, you've got no money, and Wonga comes on, one of them's called Wonga, and says, why don't you get me £200 here, pay it back next week. And down the very time writing is an interest rate 2,000% a year.
2,000%?
A year.
If you fall behind on the...
Obviously you pay it back presumably the next week, so it's not 2,000.
So this is legal bankruptcy.
Yeah.
I think it's nice when press conferences have an educational aspect as well. Any comments from Germany or Greece? Anything similar? If not,
It's a wonderful
We do not
British
have
thing.
this particular campaign. Of course, there's consumer credit, but not in this particular regard.
Right.
okay. This is it as far as questions are concerned. I'd like to, no, I suppose I can switch into Slovene, right? Se zahvaljujemo sem za vašo pozornost. Povabil vas samo še na delavnice, ki se bodo odvijale tekom naslednjih 2 dni. Prva bo že ob 14:30 tukaj. Je delavnica o vzrokih bančne in dolžniške krize na periferiji evrskega območja in v Sloveniji. Ob 17. druga delavnica, kako socializirati bančni sektor v Sloveniji. In na to v soboto ob 11. kako rešiti problem javnega dolga v Sloveniji. In potem v popoldnevu na soboto se začne kolektivno delo na programskem dokumentu. Hvala lepa za vašo pozornost in lep dan.